One of us is trash, and the other is a two-bit loudmouth. And this is Trash Radio.
10th President of the United States, born at Greenway, Charles City County, Virginia, on the 29th of March, 1790. He was the second son of John Tyler, Governor of Virginia in 1808 to 1811, and United States District Judge in 1812 to 1813. The family was of English descent, but the claim of relationship to the famous Wat Tyler, though always stoutly maintained by President Tyler, cannot be substantiated. John Tyler the Younger entered the grammar school of the College of William and Mary at Williamsburg in 1802 and graduated in 1807. 2 years later, he was admitted to the bar. His public life began in 1811, where he was elected a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Here, he served for 5 years, being chosen also in 1815, a member of the Council of State. In 1813, he raised a company for the defense of Richmond against the British, serving subsequently in minor operations elsewhere. From December 1816 to March 1821, Tyler was a member of the National House of Representatives, a Republican in politics, and a firm believer in the doctrines of strict construction and state sovereignty, which Thomas Jefferson had been principally instrumental in formulating. He opposed consistently the demand for internal improvements and increased tariff duties, and declined to follow Henry Clay in the proposed recognition of the independence of the Spanish colonies in South America and in the Missouri Compromise legislation. For the conduct of Andrew Jackson in Florida in the summary execution of British spies Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, he had only strong condemnation. He declined a re-election to the House in 1821. In 1823 to 1825, he was again a member of the House of Delegates in Virginia, and in 1825 was governor of the state. In 1827, he was elected to the United States Senate to succeed John Randolph. In 1829 to 1830, he also served as a member of the Virginia Constitutional Convention. Tyler's career as senator was marked by a degree of independence, which at times made his party position uncertain. Notwithstanding the fact that his political ideas continued to be those of a strict constitutionalist, believing protective tariff duties to be unconstitutional, he voted against the Tariff of Abominations, as it was called, in 1828, and also against the Tariff of 1832. Since the latter measure, though reducing duties, showed no abandonment of the protective principle. The compromise tariff of 1833, made necessary by the hostile attitude of South Carolina owed its inception largely to him, but he vetoed against the Force Bill, an act for enforcing the collection of duties, being the only senator whose vote was so recorded. His hostility to the high tariff policy, however, did not prevent him from condemning the South Carolina Ordinance of Nullification. And in the presidential election of 1832, he supported Andrew Jackson, to whose political principles and methods, as to those of his advisors, he was invincibly opposed as the, quote, least objectionable, end quote, of the various candidates. The vigorous course of the president towards South Carolina, however, led him, after 1833, to act more and more with the opposition, which presently became the Whig Party. But he was never at heart a Whig, at least as Whig principles came later to be defined. And his place is with the New Democrats of the Calhoun School. He sought to incorporate in a new code for the District of Columbia in 1832, a prohibition of the slave trade in the district, at the same time opposing the abolition of slavery there without the consent of Maryland and Virginia, which had originally ceded the district to the United States. In the controversy over the removal of the government deposits from the Bank of the United States, he sided with the bank and voted for Clay's resolution censuring Jackson for his course in the matter. In 1833, he was again elected to the Senate, notwithstanding the criticism of his independent attitude and the wide approval of Jackson's policy in regard to the bank. In the election of 1836, Tyler was supported as a candidate for the vice presidency by the Friends of Hugh L. White of Tennessee, the Democratic candidate opposed to Martin Van Buren, and received 47 votes, none of them from Virginia. When the legislature of Virginia voted instructions to its senators to support Senator Thomas Hart Benton's resolution expunging from the Journal of the Senate the resolution of censure, Tyler, though admitting the right of instruction, could not conscientiously obey the mandate, and on the 29th of February, 1836, he resigned his seat. He was, by this time, reckoned a Whig, and his refusal to favor the Van Buren administration lent color to that view. In 1838, he became once more a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and in the same year was chosen vice president of the Virginia Colonization Society, of which he had been long a vice president. In 1839, he made an unsuccessful contest for the United States senatorship. In December of that year, the Whigs, relying upon his record in Congress as a sufficient declaration of political faith, nominated him for vice president on the ticket with William Henry Harrison, expecting that the nomination would win support for the party in the South. Harrison and Tyler each received 234 electoral votes and were elected. On the 4th of April, 1841, 1 month after inauguration as vice president, Harrison died, and Tyler became president. He retained Harrison's cabinet until his veto of the bill for a fiscal corporation led to the resignation of all the members except Daniel Webster, who was bringing to a close the negotiations with Lord Ashburton for the settlement of the northeastern boundary dispute. And he not only opposed the recognition of the spoils system in appointments and removals, but kept at their posts some of the ablest ministers abroad. He stood, however, as it were, midway between the two great parties, without the leadership or support of either. Van Buren, whose influence in the practical working of politics was still great, refused to recognize him as a Democrat, and the Whigs repudiated him as a Whig, while with Clay leading the majority in Congress. Harmony between that body and the executive was from the first impossible. The annexation of Texas, achieved just before the close of his administration, seemed to commend him for a second term on that issue, and in May 1844, he was renominated by a convention of Democrats, irregularly chosen at Baltimore. The majority of the annexationists, however, would not support him, and he had further to meet the opposition of Van Buren, who had failed to secure the nomination in the regular Democratic convention, and of James Knox Polk, the regular Democratic nominee. Tyler accepted the Baltimore nomination, but on the 20th of August withdrew from the contest. From this time until the eve of the Civil War, Tyler held no public office, but his opinions on political questions continued to be sought, and he was much in demand as a speaker on public occasions. In December 1860, when South Carolina adopted its Ordinance of Secession, Tyler, though sympathizing with the state, took firm ground against disunion and exerted himself in behalf of peace. The legislature of Virginia appointed him a commissioner to confer with President James Buchanan and arrange, if possible, for the maintenance of the status quo in the matter of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, but his efforts were unavailing. He did not abate his activity, however, and the peace progress carried out by Congress assembled at Washington on the 4th of February 1861, pursuant to a resolution of the Virginia legislature, and over which he presided, was largely the result of his labors. The constitutional amendment proposed by the conference, however, did not meet with his approbation, and his action in signing and transmitting the resolution to Congress was merely formal. On the 13th of February, while absent in Washington on this mission, he was elected to the Virginia Convention at Richmond and took his seat on the 1st of March. In the convention, he advocated immediate secession as the only proper course under the circumstances. He continued to serve as a member of the convention until it adjourned in December. In the meantime, acting as one of the commissioners to negotiate a temporary union between Virginia and the Confederate States of America. He was also a member of the Provisional Confederate Congress from May 1861, when the capital of the Confederacy was removed from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond. He was elected a member of the House of Representatives of the Permanent Congress, but died on the 18th of January, 1862, in Richmond, before that body assembled.
Anatomy of the heads. It's like the news, if the news were memories of warriors dismembering a golem made of spray-on tan and talking points. Then an Amazon shows up and dances over remains of the golem's harem of mud women.
It always made me wonder how Ziz is more or less deified in various corners of the internet, even though he was on steroids. And no, we're not all gonna make it, brah. That being said, consider the following. In May 14th, 1992, football player Lyle Alzado dies of brain cancer. In this case, a rare lymphoma of the central nervous system, which he attributed to his extensive use of anabolic steroids, particularly Dianabol. Quote, I started taking anabolic steroids in 1969 and never stopped. It was addicting, mentally addicting. Now I'm sick and I'm scared. I became very violent on the field and off it. I did things only crazy people do. Once a guy sideswiped my car and I beat the hell out of him. Now look at me. My hair's gone. I wobble when I walk and have to hold on to someone for support. And I have trouble remembering things. End quote. Friedrich Nietzsche. Most people discover this German philosopher in one of two ways. Either they're forced to read about him in school, or they're curious about all the references to Nietzsche made by Monty Python. He was a brilliant student with rigorous training in German, Latin, and Greek. At the age of 24, Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was a series of dialogues arguing that death is perhaps the best possible thing a human being could ever hope for. Although it garnered immediate critical acclaim, historians consider this early work a little fumbly. He seemed to be guesstimating a lot, sprinkling his text with phrases like perhaps, maybe, and what if. It was like he had plenty of trees and a quality bomb, but nothing to start a real fire.
15 minutes here, 20 minutes there.
Later, he'd write a book appropriately titled The Gay Science, a conversation with numerous fictional characters who do in fact discuss how gay science is. A madman, in one portion of the play, famously announces that God is dead, using this simple logic. Without God, humans are deprived of absolute values or eternal truths. Absolute values and eternal truths rely upon the existence of God. Essentially, this suggests that because God can only exist due to one's faith, the God-fearing among us, trapped inside a chicken and egg infinite loop support system, from which no genuine satisfaction can ever be extracted. It was an airtight case which fell apart when people wondered, well, if God is dead, then he must have been alive at some point. Even monks and Buddhists took offense, piping up from their vows of silence to declare that God played no part whatsoever in the act of their spiritual quests. Nietzsche went on to point out that he was not actually talking about God, but rather a fascist European political structure. Either way, Nietzsche's hatred of Christians and religion as a whole would last a lifetime. He believed there simply wasn't enough love and kindness in the world to give any of it away to imaginary beings. By far, his masterwork was Human, All Too Human, first published in 1878. This was a dense, heavy text containing piercing observations which laid bare the hidden motivations underlying all aspects of human behavior. The book is organized in sections like a Bible. The chapters have titles like Man Alone by Himself, Wife and Child, and Signs of Higher and Lower Culture. Each section is divided up into individual fragments of condensed information, resembling a dictionary. Presence of witness. One is twice as happy to dive after a man who has fallen into water if people are present who do not dare to. The friend's secret. There will be but few people who, when at a loss for topics of conversation, will not reveal the more secret affairs of their friends. Joy in old age. The thinker or artist whose better self has fled into his works feels an almost malicious joy when he sees his body and spirit slowly broken into and destroyed by time. It is as if he were in a corner, watching a thief at work on his safe, all the while knowing that it is empty and that his treasures have been rescued. The infuriating thing about an individual way of life. People are always angry at anyone who chooses very individual standards for his life because of the extraordinary treatment which that grants to himself. They feel degraded, like ordinary beings. The right profession. Men seldom endure a profession if they do not believe or persuade themselves that it is basically more important than all others. Women do the same with their lovers. Boredom. Many people, especially women, do not experience boredom because they have never learned to work properly. Nietzsche talked mad shit about women and several ethnicities in this volume, even going so far as to say that doing otherwise would be contrary to nature. People who love that can't get enough of Beyond Good and Evil, whereby even Sigmund Freud's standards, Nietzsche delivers misogynistic tirades which attack women's intellectual acumen. Indeed, Freud often marveled how Nietzsche's hunches and insights behaved in synchronous agreement with the laborious results of academic psychoanalysis. In between writing, philosophizing, and being gay on the down low, Nietzsche took the time to enter into a strange friendship with composer and musician Richard Wagner, who was more than twice Nietzsche's age. It began well, but publicly degenerated into a bitter, intellectual, and emotional feud. There existed a jealous and intensely competitive love triangle between Nietzsche, Wagner, and Wagner's wife, Cosima. Or Cosima. I don't know how to pronounce that. Cosima? You figure it out. Wagner could be a manipulative brute, and the combined traumatized childhoods of Nietzsche and Cosima bound them in submission to Wagner. He would subjugate them both to seductive, emotionally abusive behavior. Wagner knew about Nietzsche being gay on the down low, and Nietzsche continued to obsess over this fact long after Wagner's death. In January of 1889, Nietzsche collapsed on a street in Turin, Italy, rapidly descending into insanity. Some blame syphilis, which wouldn't have anything resembling a cure for many years. He remained in a state of mental and physical paralysis until his death. Nietzsche's sister ended up with control over his books and papers intended for publication. She hated the Jews more than anything else, and she worked hard to ensure that Nietzsche's legacy would be used to fund the Third Reich. Maybe that's what Monty Python finds so funny. If there's anything to learn from this, it's the following. You don't argue with intellectuals. You call them gay. Gene Roddenberry was, in many ways, the ultimate Hollywood hack. He labored his whole life as writer or producer on one second-rate project after another. Gruen Guild Playhouse, Mr. District Attorney, Jane Wyman Theater, Highway Patrol, The Kaiser Aluminum Hour, West Point, Dr. Christian, Have Gun, Will Travel, Boots and Saddles, Naked City, Bat Masterson, The DuPont Show with June Allison, The Detectives, Dr. Kildare, Target, The Corruptors, The Lieutenant, Alias Smith and Jones, Genesis 2, The Quester Tapes, Planet Earth, Spectre, and Pretty Maids all in a row, courtesy of this fucking guy. He even kept on churning out second-rate crap from beyond the grave, including such dreck as Andromeda and Earth, Final Conflict. Oh, and he also wrote and produced some 1960s low-budget sci-fi program called Star Trek. Born in Texas, but raised in Hollywood, Roddenberry worked as a soldier during World War II, then as an airline pilot and a policeman, before realizing his manifest destiny of writing for television with a script for the beloved American classic, Mr. District Attorney. For the next 10 years, he worked on a series of mostly forgettable westerns, police dramas, and the occasional sci-fi story. Eventually, he turned his attention to creating his own shows, such as The Lieutenant, a program about the Marines, which starred Robert Vaughn and Dennis Hopper. When the lieutenant died an early death, Roddenberry turned his attention to another pilot which he had been shopping around the networks, the celebrated legal drama, 333 Montgomery Street. When no one wanted that one either, he began focusing on Star Trek. Hello? Ahoy hoy. Hey, you're on speakerphone. Don't be shy. Boo. Hey, when was the last time you heard a landline ring? Once again, the networks weren't especially interested, dismissing the show as, quote, too cerebral, end quote. As Roddenberry related it to an assistant, quote, CBS finally told me, no, we have a science fiction show we like. And they said it was much more adult than what I was talking about, end quote. The show turned out to be Lost in Space. Roddenberry was many things in life, but he wasn't a quitter. He convinced the network to let him shoot a second pilot, a virtually unheard of strategy at the time. The first Star Trek pilot starred Jeffrey Hunter as our intrepid captain, Majel Barrett, Roddenberry's girlfriend, as second in command, and Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock, a demonic-looking alien. NBC, the only network to give the show a second look, nixed Mr. Spock as unduly satanic and insisted that Roddenberry drop the female officer. In a move perhaps attributable to artistic integrity, Roddenberry fired his girlfriend but kept the pointy-eared devil. The show was canceled after 3 seasons, but it was a huge success in syndication, which led to movies, spin-offs, and merchandise. It was a slow process, but the show eventually brought wealth and fame to Roddenberry and Barrett, whom he eventually married and rehired on Star Trek. Naturally, all this success led to much grousing, complaining, and credit-mongering among the millions or so people it takes to put out a TV show. Not content to allow Roddenberry the one big success he could claim in his life, everyone, from the writers to the producers, lined up to claim their role in Star Trek's success. As the officially sanctioned Roddenberry machine kept churning out happy press releases, the bookshelves were becoming crowded with expose and tell-all memoirs purporting to tell the real story of Star Trek. Most of these real stories involved elevating the roles of everyone but Roddenberry, who was frequently depicted as a temperamental, egotistical, idea-stealing, womanizing jerk-off. Most of these accounts were highly suspect, at least in terms of how large these elements of Roddenberry's personality loomed relative to any other Hollywood producer picked at random. It's hard to find a producer who hasn't taken a beating over idea stealing, rightly or wrongly. As for egotistical, the man dreamt up a concept that evolved into a multi-billion-dollar franchise, pulling in more money than you or I would know what to do with every year. One might be inclined to cut him a little slack. On the other hand, sometimes It was just hard to like the guy. Roddenberry bitched up a storm when NASA honored his fictional starship by naming the first ever space shuttle prototype Enterprise. Roddenberry was annoyed because, well, the space shuttle was a lame piece of shit compared to the USS Enterprise. The womanizing charge does seem to have some merit, but no one actually seems to care that much. Much like his leading character, Captain Kirk, Roddenberry was reputed to have a legendary libido, with no small amount of success in indulging it, including with actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on the show. Majel Barrett is not on the record with any complaints. It's unclear whether this is due to lifestyle choice, denial, or disinterest. But the stories are so widespread, it's hard to believe they weren't true. In the end, regardless of the endless petty controversies, having creator of Star Trek in your obituary is no small thing. Roddenberry died of a heart attack in 1991 at the age of 70. Some of his ashes were blasted into space in 1997. His urnmate was Timothy Leary. Roddenberry was spared the indignity of having them transported on one of those piece of shit shuttles, however. They were launched in a Pegasus rocket, an even more primitive vehicle. What an indignity. Walter Winchell, the Rush Limbaugh of the 1940s, declared Toguri to be a traitor and relentlessly urged his listeners to demand that she be tried for treason. Bowing to public pressure, President Truman ordered his Attorney General to proceed against her. On July 5th, 1949, her trial began in San Francisco. It was the most expensive in American history at the time, costing what would have been a little over $11 million in today's money. The prosecution's case was a frame-up. When none of the Orphan Anne recordings turned out to contain treasonous statements, individuals were enticed to commit perjury. Former POWs testified that they had personally witnessed Iva making incriminating statements during her radio show. On September 29th, she was convicted of one count, that she, quote, spoke into a microphone concerning the loss of ships, end quote. For this, she was stripped of her U.S. citizenship, fined $10,000, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Iva was sent to the Alderson Reformatory for Women, where Axis Sally was serving at the time. Although a model prisoner in every way, whenever Iva came up for parole, she was denied. On January 28, 1956, prisoner 9380W was released. She had gotten out 3 years early with good behavior, but her ordeal was not over. The government soon began deportation hearings against her. Luckily, she prevailed and was allowed to remain in her homeland and not forcibly emigrate back to Japan. Finally, in 1977, President Gerald Ford granted Iva a full pardon after reading her story in a newspaper article. But she never received restitution for her false imprisonment, nor any apology from the nation which disowned her. Once upon a time, the Limeys hung a kraut, born at 1377 Herkimer Street, Brooklyn, New York. How, you ask? Well, check this out. William Joyce was a German citizen, formerly an American, who had been a radio propagandist for the Reich. His nightly broadcasts from Berlin had made him infamous in England. In 1946, Joyce was executed by the British for acts of high treason committed against the Crown, despite the fact that he had never once been a British subject, not even for one day. William Joyce was born to the Shelbyville of Queens in Brooklyn. At the age of 3, his family moved to Ireland. They remained there until Joyce turned 17, when they moved to London. Although he and his family claimed several times on various government forms that William was a, quote, British subject by birth, end quote, this was not the case. Nor did he ever become a naturalized citizen. The boy was living as an American abroad, pure and simple. When he went to college, Joyce ended up with the fascist movement. He became a member of British Fascisti Limited, a group which lionized and emulated Mussolini. Later, Joyce left and secured a paid position in the British Union of Fascists, eventually becoming its director of propaganda. The BUF had Adolf Hitler as their hero. In August 1939, Joyce learns that MI5 was getting ready to place him into custody for an indefinite length of time to quell his agitating Joyce did the sensible thing and secretly escaped to Germany with his wife. Only 3 weeks later, Joyce was doing radio broadcasts for the propaganda ministry of Joseph Goebbels. There, Joyce inherited the title Lord Haw Haw from the traitorous Englishman who had been doing the broadcast before him. The radio show consisted of Joyce reading propaganda into a microphone. The scripts were contrived to generate in the listening British fear and mistrust of their government. Much of the content was laughably stupid, but every once in a while he managed to creep out his audience. In 1940, Joyce wrote a volume titled Twilight Over England. The Path to Democracy is the Road to Oblivion. The book was conceived as an appeal to the ordinary British man or woman fed up with the war. Okay, so the title isn't exactly inspiring. And the book is better for keeping a door open than reading it. In fact, the propaganda ministry decided not to circulate Twilight Over England outside of Germany. So it was mainly used to convert British POWs. But the British really hated Joyce. By using the airwaves, it enabled the Germans to transmit propaganda directly into the living rooms of the British populace. This was a significant innovation in psychological warfare. And according to an internal report of the British government, the broadcasts had a real effect. Quote, "The effect of Haw Haw is considered in this region, Bristol, to be extremely insidious, and this danger is underestimated by the BBC and the government, who do not fully appreciate to what extent this propaganda is believed." End quote. And the Germans knew it. Joseph Goebbels wrote, quote, "Our English radio broadcasts are being taken with deadly seriousness in England. Lord Haw Haw's name is on everybody's lips. We do not react, but intensify our broadcast." End quote. On May 28th, 1945, Joyce was captured in a German forest by 2 British officers, gathering a truckload of firewood. Near Flensburg, on the Danish border, Captain Alexander Adrian Licorice of the Reconnaissance Regiment and Lieutenant Perry came upon an odd, tramp-like figure in a walking stick. The tramp pointed to some logs with his walking stick and addressed the men in French. Then he said in English, "Oh, there are 3 or 4 more here." The duo immediately recognized the voice of Lord Haw Haw. Perry engaged the man in conversation for a few minutes about coniferous and deciduous trees. After which Perry became certain it was Joyce. Joyce had kept his left hand in his pocket the entire time. When Joyce picked up a log with both hands, Perry asked him, "You wouldn't be William Joyce by any chance, would you?" Joyce's hand fell back into his pocket. Perry drew his gun and shot him in the leg. Joyce was carrying 2 passports, one of them in his own name and another under the pseudonym Wilhelm Hansen. Joyce was taken back to London on a stretcher, where he stood trial for high treason. Nobody denied that he had made the radio broadcasts. The only issue was whether Britain had any jurisdiction. By now, Joyce had become a German citizen. Before that, he had been an American. But the prosecution argued that during the period that Joyce held a valid British passport, he had a reciprocal duty to Great Britain. It's a ridiculous argument today, and it was equally ridiculous then. But the British were determined to rid the world of Lord Haw Haw. So their courts upheld the legal farce. And that's how the Limeys hanged a kraut for treason. Love it or hate it, Star Trek pervades Western civilization like the Great Plague pervaded the Dark Ages, only with slightly fewer boils. Gene Roddenberry's dopey vision of a utopia first hit the airwaves in 1966 with an atrociously bad hour-long story about a hairy sci-fi salt vampire with the power to shapeshift into the form of a buxom babe in a lame miniskirt. Despite this unfortunate start, the show generated some buzz, while Roddenberry himself vacillated between adolescent egomaniac and inspired visionary. His storytelling skills, per se, were never remarkable. Fortunately, the debut of a high-profile science fiction show with then unprecedented special effects attracted some of the greatest minds in the genre, from Frederick Pohl to Harlan Ellison. Is it Ellison? Who cares? These writers helped craft some of the greatest science fiction on television, with tales of time travel, alien mating rituals, and mind-bending parallel universes. Just to even things out, these groundbreaking epics of creative storytelling were interspersed with unwatchable disasters about fascist female aliens stealing brains and heavy-handed Christian allegories. The series made B-list Hollywood stars out of hammy overachiever William Shatner, and Leonard I'm Too Good for This Nimoy as the lead characters Captain James T. Kirk and Mr. Spock, and made enduring C-list celebrities out of the rest of the cast. The most notable influence of the original Star Trek was on the development of technology. Star Trek debuted just before silicon chips made their explosive arrival in society. And the shape of things to come adapted to reflect the cool gizmos employed by the intrepid crew of the Enterprise. Lieutenant Uhura's Bluetooth and a box with skis on a string notwithstanding. The flip-open communicators used by the characters were a primary influence on cell phone designers back in the day, the most obvious example. But anything, from a TV to computers, show the influence of Star Trek to greater and lesser extents. The show also set the bar for a number of things, like virtual reality, which is beyond development, but nowhere near public testing, and voice-activated computers, but not in the way you'd think. Even research by quantum physicists into teleportation, once thought scientifically impossible, has been influenced by Star Trek. Star Trek also played a strong role in foreshadowing and encouraging social trends, most notably the elevation of women and minorities. The crew of the Enterprise was a remarkably diverse bunch. The bridge crew regularly featured a black woman and an Asian man, working as professionals on an equal footing with their honky compatriots. They even had the other kind of white, Russian, in the form of Chekhov, introduced during the height of the Cold War. Nichelle Nichols, who played the ship's communication officer and Bluetooth pioneer, Uhura, was considering quitting midway through the show's run because her character often had little to do, but she was exhorted to stay by Martin Luther King, who felt the character's presence conveyed a powerful message of equality to young people. I wonder what Malcolm X thought about that. Later in the series, Nichols and Shatner would share the first interracial kiss ever shown on television. Other episodes directly and allegorically addressed heavy social issues of race, gender, sexual mores, reproductive freedom, and violence, often with notable success. Nichelle Nichols, who played the ship's communication officer and Bluetooth pioneer, Uhura, was considering quitting midway through the show's run because her character often had little to do. But she was exhorted to stay by Martin Luther King, who felt the character's presence conveyed a powerful message of equality to young people. I wonder what Malcolm X thought about that. Later in the series, Nichols and Shatner would take part in the first interracial kiss ever shown on television. Other episodes directly and allegorically addressed heavy social issues of race, gender, sexual mores, reproductive freedom, and violence, often with notable success. Naturally, all this thoughtful progressiveness baffled the network executives at NBC, who bounced the show around between several different time slots before canceling it ignominiously in the middle of its third season. Instead of being forgotten, as so many shows of its generation were, Star Trek found new life in syndicated reruns, and its popularity grew steadily despite its apparent demise. When Star Wars came out in 1976, the resurgence of interest in sci-fi led to the first Star Trek movie, which debuted in 1979. Freed from the constraints of network television, Star Trek, the motion picture, allowed Gene Roddenberry to fully realize his vision of what it was all about. The result was a charmless 2-hour-plus movie with a lot of talk and very little action. Despite these flaws, the movie did well enough to inspire a sequel at a lower budget. They didn't let Roddenberry write that one, so it was a smash hit, and the franchise was reborn. More movies followed, mostly dwelling on how very old the cast members had become. They were in their 40s, hardly decrepit. The solution to this terrible aging problem was to create an all-new Star Trek set in the 24th century, 80 years after the original. Star Trek: The Next Generation cleverly eliminated the age problem by featuring a captain who was already older than any of the original cast members. In all fairness, however, Patrick Stewart had aged quite well. Star Trek: The Next Generation began as another Roddenberry-dominated project, which is to say, it sucked. What Roddenberry brought to Star Trek should not be underestimated. The success of the show had everything to do with his vision of a bright and optimistic future in which humanity outgrew the flaws of its current age. It's just that he was a lousy writer. Fortunately, As the next generation went on, new blood entered the production team and elevated the show to even greater heights than the original had enjoyed. The next generation featured more intelligent stories than the original Star Trek, and much less campiness. In its 7-year run, it was incredibly popular and contributed more elements to the cultural lexicon, including notably the holodeck, a virtual reality entertainment much sought after by dorks and socially inept teenagers, and the Borg, a cybernetic monster race whose slogan, "Resistance is futile, you will be assimilated," became emblematic of the phenomena of the day, Microsoft, and more appropriately today, Amazon. In the 1990s, you couldn't have too much of a good thing. The ratings success led to spin-offs. The first of these was a tremendous show called Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. It featured complex stories dealing with science and religion, and extraordinary acting and character development, the likes of which had never been seen before on Star Trek, let alone most TV shows. As surely as night follows day, these qualities led to much weaker ratings than the franchise had recently enjoyed. But Deep Space Nine was still the top-rated syndicated show for most of its run. So when Paramount launched its own fledgling television network, it went back to the Star Trek well for a flagship program. By then, Roddenberry had died, and with him died the concepts driving Star Trek. His replacements were arguably just as bad at writing as he was, except without the whole inspired visionary thing. Star Trek Voyager debuted in 1995, and it was awful. Not awful in the sense of the brain-stealing aliens from the original series, but more in the sense of the numbingly tedious, formulaic tripe mentality that won television its reputation as a vast wasteland. Voyager ground out 7 seasons of flavorless gruel under the label of Star Trek for steadily sinking ratings, despite the addition of 7 of 9. While a series of the Next Generation based movies met with mixed results at the box office. Roddenberry's heirs within the franchise, a creative team by the names of Rick Berman and Brandon Braga, carefully analyzed the decline and determined conclusively that the problem was everything except their own limitations. Obviously, a new direction was needed. They bought in John Logan, an Oscar-winning screenwriter, to handle the final Next Generation movie. The result was a nonsensical flop called Star Trek Nemesis, which manages to both suck and blow at the same time. They also retooled the franchise for another installment. The fifth Star Trek series was called Enterprise, and they notably left Star Trek out of the title to symbolize just how new and exciting it would all be. Repeatedly citing their desire to write along the lines of The Sopranos, Berman and Braga couldn't actually get hired on The Sopranos, so they decided to set their new series before the first Star Trek. Their rationale, and I wish I was making this up, was that they couldn't do good writing set in the 24th century because people in the 24th century had good diction, and therefore all their dialogue was reminiscent of such worthless hacks as Shakespeare and Dickens. Other radical changes include having a pretty cute Vulcan chick instead of a Borg chick, adding a painfully bad Rod Stewart song as the theme, and cleverly creating a post-modernistic vacuum by instilling the show with an utter lack of characterization or plot. Amazingly, the ratings continued to blow chunks. The show was canceled in 2005. When you're not good enough for UPN, that's really saying something. For the most part, everything beyond that fucking sucks. The future for Star Trek is unclear, but it's probably not as idealistic and optimistic as Gene Roddenberry's vision of a future utopia, with literally billions of dollars in revenues generated by everything from action figures to video games to books to third-rate merch. There's precious little chance that anyone at Paramount will allow Star Trek to go gentle into that good night while there's still 1 cent of cash to be wrung from its corpse. Star Trek might not continue to prosper, but it will almost certainly live long. And with an infinite number of monkeys working on an infinite number of word processors, who knows? Maybe it'll even be good again someday.
What's up, ladies and jerks? You like things that don't suck. So for more of the finest garbage this side of Meat Space, come on down to the Trash Radio Patreon. I can't promise that my buttery, trashy voice will stop rearranging things in your living room when you're not home.